Hi, this is Abel Sanchez, and this is my history final. So, freedom to me is the idea of identity. Identity is a very important aspect in my life because it's something I've always struggled with. And just to give you an example, many there's been way too much events very similar to what I'm about to say. But say there's a group of people I want to be really good friends with, or I just want to, fit in with a certain crowd, whatever, right? And I want to shift myself with that way of thinking within that group of people. And that's not a really good way to go about finding yourself and finding your identity. You're finding your identity when you do that, you're finding your identity within others, not necessarily yourself. And of course, you know it's very it's very important to try to fit in, try to have friends, have people, you need a community. But when it's compromising your person, it's not a really good way to go about it. And that's something that I really thought about throughout this second half of the course was, the about identity, and we discussed identity politics within within the 1960s, within the 1960s lesson. And it's very important to, really get into that idea that freedom is about identity, because I think we've always been fed ever since we were younger, or it's just a generalized idea that freedom is doing whatever you want. But it's not a really good way to think of that. It's actually very flawed, in my opinion, because, of course, there's laws that prevent us from doing whatever we want. We can't, commit crimes and expect nothing to happen to us. Of course, there's legal repercussions for, criminal activities, criminal choices. But it's very important to not view freedom in that way, but rather in identity, and aligning freedom with identity. And going into, my historical connection with it, sorry, the Cold War of the 1960s. Well, it lasted a long time, but the Cold War, the looming threat of nuclear war, the fear of communism was something that was a very big part of the Cold War. But a very interesting thing that really caught my attention when we were learning about the Cold War was this weird competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. So, in one of the modules, they would in the lesson that we learned, there was this convention, and it was actually led by both U.S. leaders and USSR leaders. And basically, what it was two models. One of the models was a model of a household in the United States, and then the other one was one of the USSR. And basically, the leaders were just saying, "Oh, look at our appliances, look at our technology, look at the way that these people live, look at the way that our people live. That's why we're the better country. That's why, because, of course, back in that time, the United States and the USSR were both very big competing powers within the world at the time. And it was very clear that the United States government had this, objective of, you know of aligning freedom with your choices within capitalism, within consumerism, within, aligning yourself with all of society, with traditional values, but with a lot of things that were going on in the 60s, that wasn't what Americans wanted. And in fact, just to mention a really big event within the 1960s, the Vietnam War, very huge, very overlooming event throughout the 1960s. The United States was involved with the war in Vietnam, and they were making really huge, reckless, and dangerous decisions within their involvement of the war. And it did not sit well with a lot of people. It was a very unpopular war. And a lot of Americans made it very clear that they were not for the war. And it was very surprising because, of course, this is post, you can consider the 1960s being post World War II, post Korean War, where a lot of patriotism, the morality of patriotism was very high at that point. But the American people recognized that US decisions within the war was not for the benefit of the people. And, in a way, what ended up happening was that, you know, um, there was still this idea that the United States government was pushing um, about how, our country is better because we have this and we have that. But the United States, the 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 country, the citizens of this country didn't agree with that. They went against that, and it introduced this huge movement of huge individualism. For example, the hippie movement was a huge change. Coming in from the traditional and very conservative styles, values, patriotism of the 1950s and 40s. you know this movement was advocating for the ending of the war, and a very big part of it was condemning US actions. The wars that we had fought till then were considered favorable in the public eye, but when it went down to US involvement in Vietnam, it didn't sit well with people. And a way that people understood their freedom in fighting against US involvement in the war was embracing their own identity, embracing, a very unorthodox change that was going on throughout the country. And that was a really big thing. And it the American people during this time really showed to the world that freedom did not align with what you were able to do, what you were capable of doing, what your choices were, what you can that you can do whatever you want. No, they showed the world that freedom is aligned with your identity. And it is something that I really love understanding. And it's a very interesting decade, and especially since throughout our conversation about the 60s, that was something that just kept on popping in my head. And especially with identity politics, of course, at the same time, there was a civil rights movement, the feminist movement, gay liberation, Chicano movement. There was so much different things that, correlated to one person's identity and how they can use their identity to fight back injustices. And it is something that I really loved learning about within our class. But just to end with this final, um, I want you to finish this video with understanding this. You are your own person, and that you hear that everywhere. And it sounds like a broken record, even though I haven't said it that much, but it can be such a broken record, especially with the idea that you know it's such a commonly used thing. But you are your own person. You have your own body, you have your own thought thinking process, you have your own everything. And there's power to that. And that power is freedom. That power is your identity. Never let anybody take that away from you. And you know, it's very interesting because the next time that you involve yourself within a historical conversation, just remind yourself about the idea of freedom. Scratch the idea of doing whatever you want as freedom, scratch that out of your brain. think about identity from now on in your conversations, and it can make you really, really think about everything that's going on, everything that has gone on, and really think into historical context of so many things that have been done throughout this history of this nation. Thank you very much for listening. Have a nice day.